Hey, what's going on today, guys? Coming at you today with another episode in the Unknown series. This time I'll be giving the African American experience of the Civil War through a man named James Henry Gooding. He was born in Troy, New York in the early 1840s, late 1850s, usually in the late 1850s. He was a whaler, and he grew up around New Bedford, Massachusetts. He would eventually become a whaler, where it was the only instance where he could be on equal footing with his fellow white Americans, where he could earn a decent living and a decent wage. And then the war comes along. The Civil War, obviously, as you know, was the cause of slavery. And to him, he knew what this was about, even though he was a free man. He was born in the North. And essentially, he gets involved in this, and he knows what the war's cause is. He knows what it means to everybody, to his race and to his people, and especially too with him facing discrimination on an almost incessant rage, even though he lived in one of the most progressive states there, along with Wisconsin and Minnesota and others. And essentially what happened was the war comes along. African Americans are not required to enlist. They're not allowed to enlist due to a law in 1792, which banned them from actually joining the service to actually fight for their country. And essentially, the war comes along. And as they go deeper into the war, the Emancipation Proclamation comes up. And now, by law, African Americans are now allowed to enlist. And James Henry Gooding took note of this. And even before then, there were other units being formed. But when the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers came along to his town, because when they were forming the regiment, they had to go everywhere. They couldn't just limit it to Massachusetts alone. And so they even went to Canada and New York in some places, and even the most racist city of the country at the time in the North, Philadelphia. They would only depend on free men. Only free men. Free men only. Because they wanted to know if they did not know the whip or the lash, or that they didn't have to call anyone master. And they wanted to be educated men. So half the time, half of the regiment, sometimes a third of it, were from the North. They were free men. And most of them joined up to prove that they were men, to prove that they were of equal footing with white soldiers, and to show that they were human and that they can stand in the face of combat. And that's why they joined up, and also joined up, but also to fight for their citizenship, which is the main thing that what they were fighting for. And so James Henry Gooding comes up and joins along. And now at this point, essentially, he just, in his letter in his experiences when he's fighting, he sends these letters to a New Bedford Mercury newspaper, where he writes about the daily experiences of what an African American soldier's life was like. And in the beginning of his letters, he essentially just describes men getting together, drilling, even showing that they were even disciplined even before they came into the regiment, because before African Americans were allowed to enlist, they essentially formed their own regiments outside of white soldiers' camps, and they disciplined themselves by doing drills, etc. So these men were very well disciplined, already proving wrong the theory that black men couldn't do anything equal on same footing with white men. And he also talked about how people would come and just watch it like if it was a circus when they were performing their drills and everything. And essentially, just like James Henry Gooding describes, they would learn the techniques of war, and they did it well. They executed their disciplines very, very well. And especially if you've seen the movie Glory, where that kind of inaccurately describes how nobody could tell their right from their left, which is not true. So his letters, James's letters, always just throw that out the window. Then obviously they train, and they just talk, and he just talked about in his letters how each day new men would come in. We would do drilling day and night, drill, break, drill, drill, drill. it's kind of the typical way a Civil War regiment kind of, just does their thing. And then after that, their colors are presented to their Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. And James is a whole witness of this, showing that his commander is starting to understand his men. Because when you look at Robert Gould Shaw, James Henry Gooding and the rest of the men of the 54th looked up to him. They loved him. They loved him as their leader. They loved it that he's taking part in this great undertaking to help prove that they're men. Even though Robert Gould Shaw had a little bit of racialism in his letters, calling them the N-word and calling them sorts of names I will not say on this video. But he would actually start seeing them as human beings right up to training, right up until he goes to war with them. And after the training, they get their orders. The 54th is shipped off to South Carolina to the Department of South near the harbor of Charleston. And that's where their main operation of theaters were going to be. So they arrive. James Henry Gooding describes the environment that was around them. He said that in his letters, pickets would be more on look for snakes and alligators than of rebels when they were on picket duty, because they were mainly around beaches, sand dunes, swamps, typical South Carolina weather that's really brutal to fight a war in. And at that point, he describes all this going on. He'll describe the marches that they had to take, the different commanders they met, the different people they met. It's just like in my last episode. He experiences everything in the span of time, and it's just incredible to see that he's very articulate in the way he talks, and especially too about how he feels about the war, and how he basically said to his fellow race, "Why can't you take up arms? Why aren't you proving your manhood?" And he describes that all throughout his letters, on the march, and not only on training, but on the march, at battle, etc. And especially too when after the 54th's first fight on James Island, James Henry Gooding describes very good detail how that battle went down in the Battle of James Island, South Carolina, and showing how brave the men fought, how they managed to hold off a horde of rebel Confederate regiments, and proving that they were men. And then after that, it won the praise of every single unit in their command that was around them, particularly the white regiments that were there with them, and also talks about how he felt towards the issue of the government's issue of unequal pay, which white soldiers were paid $13 a month, or money were raised and deducted in clothing, while for African American soldiers at that time they were only paid $10 a month, and that was also $3 deducted of their clothing. And you have to realize at this time, just think about this, these men had families. They had families up in the north that needed that money. And so as a result, James Henry Gooding just says in his letter, we just decided we're not going to take any money and we're going to fight without it. And so they did that as a little protest to do that. And so, but they had other things coming up in the road ahead. And this would eventually lead up to the huge culmination of the big battle of Fort Wagner on Morris Island, South Carolina. Now, in this battle, James also describes the heavy combat that he witnessed to see men get cut down like it was swabs of wheat, I believe is what he said in his letters. He charged with his regiment on the beach, going toward the fort, taking cannon shots as they come along. If you think of the scene from the movie Glory, just think about that, where men are just getting cut down by musketry and cannons. They're getting cut down, men's arms being flown off, heads being bodies being blown off. But remember, they're not running. So this fight is proving that they are men and that they are citizens. And they're charging through the moat that's shown in the movie, where Fort Wagner had a little moat where the water drainage would go out into the sea. Men being cut down. Confederate soldiers would throw little hand grenades down on them to pull them up at some point. and blow them up at where men flying in the air. Intense combat, very intense firing taken by the 54th. And then, obviously, if some of you know, if you don't know, spoiler alert, Robert Booth Shaw gets shot in the heart and is instantly killed on the redoubt wall of Fort Wagner, and the regiment charging up it. James Henry Gooding would also charge up it as well, seeing men fall around him fighting to the bitter end, fighting off Confederates, fighting off different Confederate regiments that come under waves of them coming up, and he would witness the color bearer go down, and he also witnessed Williams Carney, who was the color sergeant, pick up the flag, being shot 4 times, and at that point they were forced to retreat back to their lines, while being shot at along the way, trying to evade shot, and obviously witnessing Carney being just battered and everything, just taking the flag back. Even white troops asked him if he needed help, and he said, "No, I'm going to take this back myself." And then he would reach back to the camp saying, "Boys, the flag never touched the ground." And he would win the Medal of Honor until he would get this Medal of Honor until 1900. And James witnessed all of this. And then people think that's where the story ends, but with James's letters, it doesn't. It doesn't end after that. He witnessed all these deaths perpetrated by their assault on this fort, but then later the fort had to be taken under siege. And so during this instance, his letters talk about we would dig lines, sometimes 3 feet a day. It'd be raining half the time. We'd be exhausted. Sand would be put up in our face. Water would be up to our knees. It's really hellish conditions to work in. And plus on that, they would get bombarded by the fort on their trench lines. Some men would get wounded, sometimes killed. Stretcher bearers would be coming in. And could you imagine all these stretcher bearers coming in with seeing their comrades being blown up or shot by sharpshooters, or being shot at by the other forts around the area. They would have to yell for cover and get into the trenches. Essentially, it's like Khe Sanh, where if you see the footage of American Marines ducking down, that's essentially what happened when they were trying to take siege of Fort Wagner. And James helped in on all of this. He witnessed that he survived all of this, and yet they're still not getting the equal treatment they deserve. And I'm going to share you one letter where he's still keeping on track of how the government's doing with the pay issue, and he really sees it through this really powerful excerpt in one of his letters, and I'll read it to you. And this is around July 25th, I believe, right after the Battle of Fort Wagner. He says, "Too many of our comrades' bones lie bleaching near the walls of Fort Wagner to subtract even 1 cent from our hard-earned pay. If the nation can ill afford to pay us, we are men, and we do our duty while we are here without a murmur, as we have done always before, and since that day we were offered to sell our manhood for $10 per month." Wow. And that shows you that it's like, are our sacrifices being in vain? We're putting our lives on the line for you to protect this country and to free our people and to prove that we are citizens, yet you're still treating us as unequals, and that therefore we're not going to take your pay until we get it. So we're going to fight without pay. And that issue would later be turned on. It would eventually be solved in the middle of 1864, right after the year that the 54th goes in siege operations. And he just describes the things he saw, the celebrations that they witnessed, the weather, etc., but also describing the life of a soldier, an African-American soldier who's putting his life on the line. Just, and also just what he thought of the rebels too, where he's saying, this is why I'm fighting against these rebels, to prove that I'm equal, to prove that my people are human beings, and that I'm also fighting to free my people. It really goes in really good detail about that. But eventually, the fort gets taken. Now, this is what the Glory movie gets run. So at the end of the movie Glory, they say the fort was never taken. That is a lie. The fort was taken in September of 1863 after huge bombardments of there. That's another thing James talks about, this incessant bombardment by ships off the coast and artillery on land, just blowing the crap out of everything. I mean, could you imagine being up at night, seeing flashes, being on picket at night for the 54th, and just seeing tons of bombs being dropped in this fort. Not only that, but on Fort Sumter, James would witness it just being crumbled and just being wasted away, as he said in one of his letters. He said at night you could see the mortar rounds, and if you heard of mortars, are those big, huge cannons that you see in pictures of the Civil War. They'd be shot up. You could see archers going in the sky, bombarding Charleston. It's essentially a siege warfare, and he's just witnessing all this. I couldn't imagine if he just hadn't got any sleep, which is what happened to them sometimes when they would march, especially before Fort Wagner, where they had to march in stormy, rainy weather. They had to march through this muck and guck. They were tired. They were exhausted. Sweat pouring down their face. They haven't eaten anything or slept for 10 days. This is what happens sometimes, and especially where we get new orders. And now this is where the kind of turning point comes, where James essentially now and his regiment have been transferred to operations near Jacksonville in Florida, and he describes his regiment just having good high hopes and cheers of not ever having to go on Morris Island ever again. And when they arrive at Jacksonville in there, Florida, they essentially see that the town was already been occupied by Union forces, because Abraham Lincoln's goal was to make Florida a free state and to make sure to drive all Confederate forces out of there. So what happened is that once they arrived, though, there were still Confederate soldiers and cavalrymen in that area. And once the 54th was coming in, they're being shot at while they were being landed in. And so they sent pickets out to get after them. But eventually they couldn't find them later until they would meet them at Lysse Station, which is a couple miles south or north of Jacksonville. And what happens next is a very tragic story. But before that, I'm talking about the details of what happened. So Lysse Station was a huge conversion point for the Confederate forces in Florida. And the 54th and their army of about 7,000 men had to take that in order to cut that off from their main supply lines. And they had to march a couple miles in, camp, etc. Just talk, and James, again, his letters just describes so eloquently how the forces everywhere just march to this point in this position, march at this point in this position, just constant movement by his regiment. And just talking about one time, how everything was quiet, how on the march, even before the battle even occurred at Lysse Station, they basically, right before a tragic letter was sent to the, this is going to be tough. This is where it's going to be really hard, guys. Prisoners brought down to Jacksonville this afternoon. This is him talking about it. And 2 cars driven by mules at the engines on the road have been purposely damaged to prevent our using them. At last count, the survivor column was beyond Palatka, which is in Florida, having met no strenuous opposition yet. And so they would eventually meet these forces at Lysse. And James Henry Gooding, along with his regiment, would fight in this regiment, holding off waves after waves at Lysse Station of Confederate regiments, just pounding at them, suffering really terrible casualties. Again, showing their bravery and showing that they were citizens. But in the end, something tragic happens. And I will read you the letter that is very tragic. Mercury, March 9th, 1864, Jacksonville, Florida, February 25th, 1864. This is right after the Battle of Lysse. Messieurs editors, I am pained to inform you that Corporal James H. Gooding was killed in the Battle of the 20th in Sindley at Lysse Station. He was one of the color corporals and was with the colors at the time. So great was the rout of our troops that we left nearly all our dead and wounded on the field. The fight lasted 4 hours. We were badly beaten that night, and the next day we kept falling back until we reached Jacksonville. The 54th did honor to themselves and our city. All can see that no regiment fought like it. And he also read out of his friends from New Bedford who were there, who were killed. James H. Buchanan, New Bedford, was killed, and Sergeant Warren H. William, also of our city, was wounded in the hand. Many others of Company C were wounded, and this was the company that James was a part of in the 54th. The regiment is pleased to learn that the bill to pay them $13 per month passed. Think about that. Think about that. He had to wait. He died on the month that the $13 per month thing was passed for equal pay. It's just tragic. A total loss of regiment. I'm unable to give you at this time. All we want now is more troops. With them, we could go forward again and drive the rebels from the state. And essentially, that's what happened. But there's a twist, though. He wasn't killed. He was wounded in the thigh. During the intense fight, he was wounded in the thigh and was left there dead. And as a result, Confederate soldiers captured him. And this was where it gets really nerve-wracking, because during the Civil War, African-American soldiers were not treated as human beings when it came to war. They were more treated as a slave insurrection, and especially to the officers of stirring up servile insurrection. And the Confederate Congress would pass a proclamation saying that any Negro who fights and gets captured will be returned to a state of slavery or be put to death. And that's essentially what happened. Is a lot of African-American units, especially the colored infantry regiments, near the Battle of the Crater in Petersburg, where they were just slaughtered. The 1st Kansas colored infantry, where they lost like a half of their men because Confederate regiments singled them out for special dishonor. And obviously the 54th Massachusetts dead after the Battle of Fort Wayne, where they were just tossed in like cattle in a dead ditch, and their colonel just being stripped of naked and being mocked and ridiculed, and then throwing him in with his soldiers, which his father essentially would say it was better for him to be buried that way with his men. So you see, he could have been killed at that moment. He could have been killed, but they captured him and sent him to probably the most despicable, most dangerous POW camp in all the Civil War, Andersonville. And he would later try to survive the horrors of that camp, having limited shelter from the wind and rain and elements, having no food, disease rampant. My theory is that his wound must have had a result of that with disease, and he would eventually fight on with this disease, just enduring the hells of Andersonville, witnessing, how the prisoners were treated, to how they were just starving. He was starving too, I believe. And as a result, in the middle, I believe, in the months after he was captured, I believe in June or July, he would eventually succumb to his wound and die in 1864. And that's where he is buried today. He is buried in Andersonville National Cemetery, where he's buried along with his other comrades in arms, whether they were white or black, but it doesn't matter. They were all Americans, and they died by each other's side. And that's his story. And it's very sad to see that such a young life of him was just snatched like that, and just waiting for it to have that equal chance of saying, I'm a man, why can't you treat me the same? And he would eventually die. Then it's sad, guys. And it's something to think about, of the men that put their lives on line for us. And it really is a very touching moment as well, by saying that he was willing to die, not only just for his country, but for his race and for his people, but also for all Americans, to show that this is the land of the free and the home of the brave, and that we are all equal citizens, that we are all created equal under God. And it just shows you that. And so what I want you to take away from this is that in our own lives, what are we willing to do to lay down our lives for? James did it. His comrades in the 54th did it. In later battles, they would give up their lives either through disease, either they died by disease or combat or fatigue. And what are we willing to lay down our lives for? And I think that's the main theme in James' book, not only in his letters, but to all the men of the Civil War. What were they willing to lay down their lives for? Especially in the case of equality and showing that we are all men that are created equal. His story shows that we are all citizens of this country and that we are all equal. And his death proved that I am a man and I'm not going to be discarded or degraded. So that's my story, you guys. That's the story of James Henry Gooding. So if you find it interesting, I'll put a link in the description box below for the book. If you want to look, it's called On the Altar of Freedom. It contains all his letters describing the life of an African American soldier, experiencing the siege of Charleston, experiencing all the battles he fought. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you liked this video, give it a like, click the subscribe button, hit the bell notification button so you can get all my videos. Hopefully, what I plan to do is in the next coming months, I'm actually going to watch the movie Glory, and I'll give you guys a little movie review in that, because the anniversary of the movie Glory is coming out in the next couple of days, and it's being released at 600 theaters, so I hope it comes to my theater so I can experience it in a theater, because I've seen the movie, but I'd like to experience it in a theater. So, anyways, guys, that's going to be my video. I really hope you enjoyed this, and again, think of that theme. What are we willing to put our lives down for? And James Henry Gooding shows that, what he laid down his life for. So, that's all I'm going to give you today. You guys have a blessed rest of your day. Peace.